So similar to the undergraduate program, the graduate program in accounting has a number of program goals. And in particular, the goals that I was focusing on include the ability and students understand how to develop and integrate technology to solve business and accounting problems, that they can leverage information technology to make informed decisions, and they can leverage fundamental ideas in data science to make informed decisions. And a particular course objective that I have is to make sure that students are able to have a conceptual understanding and also hands-on use of enterprise systems. And this course is taken by about 25% of the graduate accounting students. Next slide, please. Now, the course has a heavy technology flavor to it, as one would expect. And so the first task that students have is the use of a general ledger software package. And what I'm trying to do in this particular task is to have students experience what an organization has to go through as they are selecting and implementing an ERP package. And so the students have to go out and find a general ledger package. They have to then take a series of transactions, which I've prepared for them, which of course have errors in it, and implement that into the general ledger package. They then need to generate their financials and then report out on the financials. And of course, when all the teams report back their financials, there's a whole wide variety of answers that there's no consistency in terms of what net income is. So then they also have to do what an organization does, is to say, okay, now that you've got two systems that came up with different responses, you have to go back and reconcile what are the differences. And so the students have to use other students' results. They provide them with an audit trail of what they have done, and reconcile what changes do they need to make. Of course, I get some pushback from students saying, well, you don't get, what's the right answer? What should the income be? And say, well, no, sorry, you've got to figure this one out on your own. After they do that, then I have them use MonsoonSIM. And the objective that I have is to have them use a simulation of how an enterprise system should work when it is being implemented correctly within an organization. And so it abstracts from reality and it really shows all the important aspects of an enterprise system. After we do that, I have them use Celonis, which is a process mining software, so they can visualize and understand the business process flows. Now, we all know what the flows should be if we're saying order to cash or procure to pay, but then what we really need to do is have the students understand that, well, that's the ideal way and what we should see most of the time, but there always will be different workarounds. And so that's always going to be, that the students discover this whole spaghetti bowl of processes that occur. And finally, after that, I have them use SAP Business by Design, which is the small and medium-sized enterprise version of the SAP software. And here's the hands-on use of that ERP package. And so in Monsoon SIM, they saw the abstraction of how it should work. Now, when they're using it by design, they get to see all the gory details, which really has them open their eyes to say, wow, to do a bill of materials, there's so much work that we have to do. To do a bill of operations, all this additional work. So it really shows a lot of the details that are hidden within the abstraction of Monsoon SIM. Next slide, please. So the objectives that I have for using of Monsoon SIM in the ERP class is really to see students see how enterprise systems facilitate business management, the importance of communication within the organization. And here it's twofold, both how the communication is facilitated and provided by the enterprise system, and then also how they have to communicate among the team members as they are running their business. And finally, the role of accounting information within the enterprise. Next slide. Now, why did I select Monsoon SIM? Well, I had used a different simulation in the past. I had used ERP SIM that is based upon SAP. And well, it worked, it didn't have enough richness. And so I wasn't really feeling I could accomplish all that I would really like to have this simulation provide. And so I had the opportunity to attend a Monsoon SIM introduction and training session. And I was really impressed with the software. And I was impressed with how the simulation captured and updated all the information in real time. There was complexity that was embedded within the simulation that could be controlled by the instructor. It was HTML5 or cloud-based, which was important for me because it works with both Macs and PCs, and about half my students are on Macs and the other half are over on Windows machines. And then it's from my perspective, I thought it was very easy to use as a facilitator, and students, once they started to go through and use the simulation, play the simulation, they found it very easy to get up to speed. And finally, it turned out to be a very fun, competitive task. Next slide. So similar to Sue, I had my students, teams of 3 and 4, same type of pre-work as she had mentioned. And I ended up using 4 100-minute class periods over 2 weeks. And the first 2 periods were used to familiarize the students with Monsoon SIM. And I slowly increased the level of complexity. And I'll show you how I did that in just a minute. And then the last 2 class periods were used for competition. And the students knew from the start what the KPIs that were going to be used for evaluating the performance. I scored each competition day separately. And then their overall score was based upon the team average over the 2 days. The reason I did that is the first time I used Monsoon SIM, I had it occur being based over the 2-day performance without a break. And one team discovered a way that they could really gain a monopoly control in one city. And so all the other teams saw that they were just running away with the game, and it lost some of that competitive edge that I wanted it to have. So I adjusted it to say, okay, each day was going to be a fresh start so that every team could feel like they had a chance to win that day. Next slide, please. So as Abdi had shown, here's the full Monsoon SIM in when you'd be using all of the modules. Well, obviously that's way too much for starting off with students with. So I ended up starting off with just the retail environment. And so over here, the students would have, we set up the general parameters, the financial parameters, procurement, and retail setting. And so if we take a look at the next slide, we can see, under the finance heading, a number of the different parameters that you can select. Are you going to have journal entries? Are there going to be loans? What's the initial dollar amount of cash? What's the interest charges? What's the overdraft limit? And then if you're running out of, when you have delinquent payments, an overflow fee, meaning that if you have too much product to fit in your store, how much is it going to cost you to store that additional product? So a number of parameters that you can select. Next slide, please. Also on the retail setting, there are a number of parameters. And this is one that I think is kind of fun, where especially when students will have the stores all located in the same city. You can identify how loyal will the customers be. And then you can have the loyalty change throughout the game. So the students have to react to that. And then on the bottom of the screen, you can see the holiday that is listed. And so you can select which days are going to have holidays, that is increased sales. Also in one of the other settings under the general heading, general settings, not shown here, is one where you can have a crisis occur. And so I thought in the second day I'd have a crisis occur, which I ended up calling a pandemic. I don't know why a pandemic came up as a good idea, but I thought it was a fun one to use. Next slide, please. So then after we had gone through the retail setting for a while, I asked the students, well, what other information would you need? What else would make this better for you? And they said, it'd be great to know where competitors were located. It would be good to know, what is the forecast for the sales for our products? So we can start planning or doing some demand planning. And then, how else can we say what should be our advertising? Will advertising help increase our sales? So added in the marketing and forecasting modules. Next slide, please. And under marketing, I labeled 3 marketing programs as social media, print, and television. You're free to label them anything that you want. And the one thing that's interesting is a marketing program will have a differential effect on only one of the 3 products. So the students have to figure out what are they going to be using within this marketing and how will it differentially work. So it's, again, they have to experiment and learn on their own. Next slide, please. So after doing the marketing and retail, I then expanded it so the students could have access to a warehousing, B2B, and B2C. And within a warehouse, the students are able to procure items at a lower price point, but then they have to make sure that they ship them over to the different retail stores. So this now means that they have to start worrying about supply chain issues. Next slide. And so under the supply chain issues, they have to start seeing what is the distance between the stores, and then they have a fixed and variable cost for the delivery of the product. So now it requires a bit more work for them in terms of saying, what is my price point that I'm getting? What price am I going to be putting these items for sale at in order to be able to remain profitable? Next slide. And finally, the last part that I added for the students is having them not only be able to have a warehouse, but also to have production in that warehouse. And so now they have to start looking at bill of materials. They have to start looking at the acquisition of machinery. And once you have machinery, now you have to start worrying about maintenance fees and making sure that the equipment does not break down. So now they have everything in terms of a very rich environment. Next slide. The two things that I did not use were HR and services, and I just didn't quite have enough time to be able to bring those in, although I'd love to bring in HR along the way. I'll have to see how I can work that in. Next slide. So similar to Susan, evaluation was based upon the performance of the game and also a reflection paper. And it was worth about 8% out of the 500 points that I had in the class. Next slide. And for one of the days, we can see how the students had applied very different strategies. If we take a look at Team 7, they only had retail stores. Team 4 had retail stores and a warehouse, and they were in every particular location. Team 10 had retail stores and a warehouse, but they were not in every location. So so teams were able to follow their own approach in terms of what they have done. Next slide. In terms of the KPI scoring, if you're more of a visual person, here's the results for the one day. And we can see over here that team 9 and 10 had performed the best. Team 6, we'll talk about that one in a little bit. And then you can see how the other teams performed. Next slide. Then again, for those of us from an accounting background, seeing it in a table format might be a little bit easier rather than just the graphic. And over here, we can see that teams 9 and 10 were neck and neck. And it would be, if it would have ran for another day or two, I'm not sure which team would have finished up on top. Team 6, well, that was me. And I had just used some of the robots that Abdi had mentioned earlier in terms of saying, okay, I'll just have this in there just as a kind of a baseline, and hopefully everybody beats that. And a disadvantage they had the first day that I ran it, my team actually went bankrupt. So, but at least it didn't go bankrupt the second day. Next slide. Similar to Susan, I had individual reflection questions. What my first question focused on, what do you learn specifically about ERP systems and business in general? And then the last question again was, should I use Monsoon SIM again in the course? Why or why not? Next slide. And so into some of the responses, one student said, I enjoyed the time using Monsoon SIM, found it interesting, educational, understand all the small items that go into a business and how everything comes together to make the business complete. It was also interesting to tackle all the obstacles thrown at us, such as vendor shortages. Next slide. This student says, I really understand the importance of information throughout the simulation. And then if you look at the demand for products, how many products we have, and order more accordingly, that's a significant driver of products. So they're able to see the whole drivers of everything that is going on. Next slide, please. The simulation helped make me better understand how an ERP system works and helpful for a business. It was important for our team to remain cognizant of our product costs and accurate pricing of and profitable B2B and B2C transactions. So it really is the accounting issues that are coming through and use of the accounting data in order to be able to maximize their profitability. So I was really glad to see this kind of a response. Next slide. For the simulation, I learned just how complex a business can be. So similar to what Susan had said, here's a student who realized, wow, this is really, really much more than I thought it would be. And then for the ERP system specifically, I learned just how useful the information generated by the system can be. And so again, and these responses were just I did not go cherry picking them, but rather I just opened up the responses, and these were about the first 4 or 5 responses that I had that the students had submitted. Next slide. I asked them, should I use Monsoon SIM again? In spring of 2022, all the students unanimous, yes. Comments, enjoyable, made me excited to go to class, highly valuable, great experience, fun competitive way to learn about ERP systems. And I really like this last quote. The simulation showed us what really goes into decision-making and running a business. I truly think I learned a lot more actually getting to use a simulated ERP system than I could have within a lecture or a book. And so from an educator perspective, I look at it and say, okay, great. Active learning really brings it home in terms of the students. But then the other part of me says, but I couldn't cover all these other topics that are important. And we all have that, push and pull in terms of those two feelings. But I think that even though the specific topics weren't covered, I think there's a lot more learning that really occurred through the use of Monsoon SIM for these students. And this quote really brings it home to me. Next slide, please. So in terms of, I used it twice in spring of 2021. We were all remote, and this past year was in class. And as you can see, numbers were 97% last year and 100% for this year. And the one student who said no, I think might be related to that student that Susan had talked about. And this student, he or she said, we went from the top 3 on the first day to second to the last. So you can take from that what you want. Next slide, please. Now, I've used Monsoon SIM. Monsoon SIM can be used in other classes. And since I'm more involved on the information system side, I'll mention it from that perspective. Next slide. To me, it'd be very easy to use Monsoon SIM in the undergrad accounting information systems course. It'd be very good in terms of allowing students to see how information should flow through through an organization. They can focus on where and how to use the accounting information. It can also show how analytics can be used. I think it'd be a great fit within the undergrad AIS course. And you would not need to use it to the level of complexity that I have. And you can just, as Abdi said, you can customize this to fit the needs of your course. Next slide, please. I've just found out a couple of weeks ago that I was going to have the opportunity to teach in the MBA program. And I'll have the opportunity to teach the MBA required information technology course. And this course has dual objectives, both the strategic use of technology and information systems, and also have the students develop some hands-on skills. And so I'm considering using and anticipating using Monsoon SIM in that course, because it really focuses on strategy, and then it requires understanding of the information flows into business. And finally, you can have skill development in terms of use of the analytics data. Next slide. I've also used Monsoon SIM in the MS Business Analytics program over here at MSU. In the analytics program, students have diverse backgrounds. We try to have about 1/3 of the students having a computer science background, 1/3 liberal arts, and 1/3 business. So that means we need to do some kind of level setting so that everyone can understand what occurs in the business, have a basic understanding of the data flows in the business, and really let students see that the business generates the internal data via the ERP, the information system, which is really shown in what comes through Monsoon SIM. And so then they can use that data from an analytics perspective to say, okay, how should they be positioning? What do they want to be doing? How should they be positioning their advertising and their products and their pricing? So it really allows them to do that level set, get the business understanding, and also apply analytics within this setting. Next slide, please. So overall, I've been very happy, very pleased with the outcomes of using Monsoon SIM. This year especially, that buzz in the classroom as the students were working on the simulation was just absolutely wonderful. It was one of those things where you just want to get out of the way and just let them keep working on it. To me, I was able to accomplish the goals that I had set for the simulation. The students enjoyed it. And as you could see through those few comments, the students really learned through that simulation. So next slide.